5-year-old Rachel was the apple of her mother's eye. Her mother, Rosalind, had cherished every moment of her only daughter's growth, first steps, birthdays, learning to talk and play. Now, even though Rosalind wasn't sure she was ready, Rachel was beginning school. It was on a long weekend when Rosalind noticed Rachel's swollen glands. Rosalind wasn't too worried. Her daughter had always been healthy and strong.
Thursday morning, she complained of a sore tummy. I had also noticed in the night that her breathing was a little bit laboured. So I wondered, if something respiratory was going on. So I called the doctor on the Thursday morning.
3 days later, Rachel underwent her first session of chemotherapy. Rosalind was stunned, completely unprepared for such a serious diagnosis. But the worst was still ahead. The next day, Rachel's health had gravely deteriorated. The following morning, Rachel watched as her tiny daughter's life ebbed away, a mere 5 days after the diagnosis.
I certainly would not judge anybody who reaches out because I felt that pain to be almost to the point of being unbearable, and some days quite unbearable. Grief has the ability to destroy us. It's powerful.
No two grief experiences are exactly the same. While each person's journey is unique, decades of research and centuries of experiences clearly show that most who travel this lonely road may well experience the following challenges.
After your initial experience with shock and denial, you may notice a feeling of fatigue. One of the most significant effects on a person who is suffering from a loss is that their mind is either going too fast or too slow. Hence, concentration and memory function are compromised significantly. You may experience disorganization and poor concentration, confusion, compromised short-term memory, or obsessing about the loss.
Felt a total lack of concentration. I actually wound up only working half-time for a while because I could not focus on what sorts of things I needed to be doing. My focus was nowhere near what I was capable of doing. It took a couple of years before I could really do that.
Paradoxically, for me, work became play and play became work. I dreaded evenings and weekends, and I actually looked forward to work.
The hardest part of grieving, I think, is the initial loss. The paralysis that sets in when someone close to you has been violently ripped out of your life. The total lack of being able to foresee your future without this person by your side. The indecision, the not knowing what to do, not knowing how to proceed. That panic that comes from helplessness, that's the worst part.
With your emotional resilience so low, family patience wears thin, and even small problems can be exhausting. Stress may show itself in both physical and mental ways. It's important to talk to your doctor about these experiences.
Well, if a person was a worrier or a person who was somewhat depressed and they have a trauma like grief, everything gets worse. It's just like lighting a fuse on a firecracker, that when they have any kind of an emotional trauma, anxiety gets worse, depression gets worse, and what was mild becomes severe.
Many people experience what's been referred to as the crazies. Time seems to be distorted, stretched, or even standing still. I've heard people say, "I have no recollection of the last 10 miles down the road. I think I'm going crazy."
Just driving to work, sometimes you hear a familiar song that I sang with my mom or whatever, and you picture that time when you were singing it together or when it came up, and I forget how I got to work.
In the deeper unconscious recesses of your mind, your brain is trying to recover from the trauma and adjust to the loss in the new world it's in. Ruminating and dissociation are the psychological terms when the brain is trying to adjust to a new life without your significant loved one. The mind has been wounded and is trying to recover. You are not going crazy. You are experiencing the grief wound.
Well, in my experience, I think grief is a trauma. So any kind of personal upset, anything that really disrupts someone's life to me is a trauma. And there's no question that any trauma can drop someone's mood and precipitate a depressive illness.
You may experience a difficult time getting to sleep or disturbing dreams. You need to be careful to not get physically exhausted because the journey requires strength and stamina.
Jeannie's story started with a chance meeting. She had no idea what to expect from the man she'd just met.
And he had asked me for my phone number, and I reached over to him and I said, well, you should know that I have 4-year-old twin boys that I'm never giving up. And he said, but you should know that I have season tickets to Buffalo Bills and I'm never giving them up. So I realized then that I was meeting a man who had a very unique sense of humor.
As these two very special people began to share their lives, they found their connection in the sheer joy of being together and the humor they both enjoyed.
And he would pick on my family and I'd pick on his, and it was just, but it was all in jest and fun. None of it was ever meant or true, but nobody ever knew what was true and what wasn't true. And then we would get home and we'd laugh about it in bed, and he'd say, oh God, it's like being on stage all the time entertaining people. But it was never tiring for us. It was so second nature to us to make people laugh and to be funny with each other that it wasn't like we didn't enjoy it. We really enjoyed it.
They were soulmates who had found a second chance for love and happiness. Now, with 25 years of marriage behind them, Bob still has the tickets, and the boys were 27. They were both in perfect health. There was little that could disturb their enjoyment of life, not even a slight fall Bob had while working in his garage.
And I thought he was fine, and he thought he was fine.
The doctor ordered a muscle relaxant, but 3 days later, when Bob's bowels still hadn't functioned normally, Jeannie was worried. The emergency room doctor recommended surgery, but wanted more tests to confirm the possibility of a bowel obstruction.
Monday they did all those tests, and I was standing by his bed on Monday at around supper time. And he was very tired and very weak, and I was trying to give him sips of water with a spoon, and he stopped breathing.
The doctors immediately intubated Bob with a tube to keep his lungs inflated.
So the doctor sat across from me and she said, you'll need to make a very difficult decision about what to do. We can keep Bob alive like this for a long time, but it won't be Bob. He'll just be able to blink his eyes.
Jeannie learned that Bob had suffered 4 brainstem strokes. He would have no brain function if he continued living. Jeannie sat down with her children and her minister. Then she went to talk to Bob, as she always had.
And we had long chats and long talks, a lot of one-sided conversation, a lot of only me laughing, but I know he was laughing inside. And we talked about what was going to happen, and Bob put himself into a coma, a very deep coma that we couldn't reach him from anymore, so I knew that he knew what he wanted.
As Jeannie, her children, and her minister gathered around Bob's bed, they said goodbye to a wonderful man who had been unexpectedly taken away from the center of their world. At home, the house is now quiet. Jeannie misses the tall 6-foot man who was a big presence in their home, her life, but most of all, her heart.
I just miss looking at him. I miss laughing with him. The emotions is just, it's empty. There's just this horrible big void that just doesn't get filled by friends, by your children, by grief counselors, by anyone. There's just this horrible void of an emptiness, a big black hole.
You might find yourself searching for your loved one, even though you know they're dead.
So I drove down to the hospital, and I parked the car like where I always parked it. I sat down in the lobby and waited to see if I would see him. And I saw a couple of doctors that treated him. I hoped that they didn't recognize me because they'd asked me what I was doing there, and I was so embarrassed that I had come there. I thought, I wonder if he's up in intensive care. But I didn't want to go there because I was so afraid the nurses would recognize me, and I just didn't want someone to think that I had gone crazy.
With all the shock and disorientation, how can you know if you're traveling down the right road?
After a period of rebalancing yourself, The goal is to rebuild a meaningful life for yourself that is productive and hopeful, while being able to retain the memory of the one who died. The journey of grief is not just linear, logical, or mechanically sequential. It's also cyclical and multidimensional. Over time, we will experience layers of loss over and over.
I think some of the things that you have to be aware of in grief, especially a couple of months after. At that time, people around you are expecting things from you. One of the things they expect from you is that you'll be getting better. You know, well, it's a couple of months now, so I guess you're feeling better, your strength is coming back. Beware that you don't fall into that trap to think that there's something wrong with you, because actually you might be feeling a bit worse. So then you start thinking something's wrong with you.
Even though there are no exact directions for the journey of grief, there are strategic and essential progress markers to let us know that we're headed in the right direction.
Allow yourself to experience and then express the internal emotions and psychological pain this death has caused you.
I had to give myself permission to feel my feelings when I was ready to feel those feelings, but not be pushed when I wasn't ready. And that was quite a challenge as well, because I think people wanted me to get over it. So part of my understanding what healthy mourning was understanding that I was never going to get over it, but I was going to be able to integrate it, to learn to live with what had happened to us so that it wasn't crippling in my life.
In the weeks and months that followed, I can now look back and see that I had not handled grief the way I would like to see someone else handle it. I had denied my own grief a great extent, believing in my heart that my grief was not as valuable as somebody else's grief in the family. For instance, my parents had lost their daughter. That was such a horrible, tragic loss for them, a loss that's unnatural, that's out of order. My brother-in-law had lost his wife, and so that was, again, out of order. It shouldn't have gone that way. The children had lost their mummy. So having lost a sister, though it was huge in my mind, I didn't allow it to be huge because others' grief was so much greater and the loss was. Therefore, I suppressed my own grief, and I think I kind of ran from it for a long time. To run into the grief would be better than to run away from the grief.
Be prepared to experience and persevere through one of the most difficult periods of emotional pain that you will experience over the next weeks, months, and perhaps years.
What surprised me about the process, I think the intensity of the feelings really surprised me. My mother was the first one that I've lost that was a significant person in my life. I had no grandparents, so I haven't gone through any losses before. So the intensity of the feelings, I think that was the shocking thing. So the intensity in some areas have grown. The intensity in the sadness has dissipated some, as far as I can remember, happy times, and we can laugh more now about her and her character and who she was as a person. But yeah, the missing her is intensified.
Take care of yourself and your family in a proactive way when the difficult days come, and they will come. In as honest a way as you know how, reconcile your relationship with the person who has died.
They need the reality that life does continue. And so I think community at all sorts of levels, it's practical, but it's also emotionally supportive, and it also bids you, come on, we're going to be with you through the hard stuff, but we're going to encourage you to keep going.
And that's helped me to exercise and eat better, maybe not necessarily right, but eat better, and just be more aware of what I'm doing to my own body. Friends are extremely important, and when something like this happens in your life, you very quickly realize who they are, because they tend to disappear because they don't know how to deal with grief. They don't know how to deal with you dealing with grief. I can honestly say that I have one really good friend that stuck by me before, during, and after, and thank God that I've got that person in my life, because without them, I'm not sure I could have got as far as I have.
Transfer and reconcile your relationship with the person who died to a place of honest honor through adjusting and affirming your purpose for living, your sense of self, and your new relationships with others.
So I just felt better saying, like, she's still gonna be the mother of the bride. It's just, yeah, she's still gonna be there in spirit.
It is good to find a way to honor the person, to acknowledge their passing, and also, if as a believer you know they're with the Lord, also rejoice in that fact that's where they are.
Consider ways to meaningfully invest in your todays and your tomorrows as you visit your yesterdays with authentic gratitude.
Arguably, the most difficult section of this journey is the volatile, surging emotions of grief.